Someone already knows they made a mistake. They have known it for longer than they would ever admit out loud. And right now, in this exact moment, that knowledge is quietly dismantling everything they thought they understood about themselves, about you, and about the choice they made to walk away. And it is entirely because of what you chose to do, not because you chased them, not because you begged or explained or made yourself smaller to fit into a story that was never true, because you held still. Because somewhere beneath all of the doubt and all of the noise, you trusted what you felt. Even when they were telling you that what you felt was wrong, this message did not find you by accident. The fact that you are here watching this means that something inside you already knows the truth and has been waiting quietly, patiently, for someone to finally say it out loud. They are struggling right now because of you, because of what they cannot unsee, because something has shifted in the interior of the person who made a mistake. And that shift does not stop once it starts. What you are about to hear will not just explain why this is happening, it will permanently change how you see yourself, this connection, and why you were right about them from the very beginning. There is a moment, and it does not announce itself, when the story someone has been telling themselves completely stops working, when the justifications they built around their choices begin to crack at the edges, when the person they convinced themselves you were starts to dissolve, and the person you actually are begins to take shape in their mind with a clarity that is almost unbearable. Not because they chose to see it, because they can no longer choose not to. That moment is happening for them right now. And Carl Jung, who spent decades mapping the parts of the human psyche that people work hardest to never look at, described exactly why this happens and why it is almost always inevitable. What is unfolding for this person is not random, it is not coincidence, it is the psychological process Jung called shadow projection, finally running out of places to hide. And when it does, everything changes for them, and in ways you may not have fully recognized yet for you. If you're still watching this, you are already part of the rare few who are willing to face what most people spend their entire lives running from. 97% of people scroll past content like this, not because it does not reach them, but because it reaches them too deeply. If this is already moving something inside you, subscribe to Carl Jung Psychology right now and turn on notifications. What you are about to hear does not just explain why someone already knows they made a mistake. It will permanently change how you see yourself. Here is what happened. When this person made their choice, when they pulled away or dismissed you, or convinced themselves that leaving was the right thing to do, they did not do it from a place of clarity. They did it from a place of noise, internal noise, the kind of noise that in Jungian psychology originates not in the present moment, but in everything a person has been carrying long before you ever entered the picture. Jung called this the shadow. And the shadow is not a dramatic thing, though it can behave dramatically when it goes unexamined long enough. It is not some dark and villainous force lurking beneath a person's surface, waiting to destroy things. The shadow is simply everything a person has been taught not to be. Every feeling they decided was too much. Every need they learned to call weakness. Every vulnerability they sealed over with confidence, with control, with distance, with the performance of not caring. Over years, sometimes over entire lifetimes, these sealed-off parts do not disappear. They accumulate, they compact, and they wait. And then someone comes along, a particular someone, who begins to reflect those buried parts back. Not intentionally, not as a strategy, simply by being who they are. By loving in a way that asks for something real. By seeing through the performance to the person underneath it. By refusing, however gently, to participate in the story. The shadow needs everyone to confirm. When that happens, the shadow does not respond with gratitude. It responds with projection. Projection, in the Jung sense, is one of the most common and least understood psychological mechanisms in human relationships. What it means at its core is this: when a person cannot face something inside themselves, a fear, a need, a longing, a wound, they begin to see it in the people around them. Instead, they take the feeling they cannot hold and they assign it outward. They outsource the inner experience to someone else so that they do not have to claim it as their own, so that they do not have to look at it directly, so that they can keep the image of themselves intact, rational, fair, justified, while still finding somewhere for the disowned feeling to live. And you became the screen. This is why the things they said about you, or the way they framed what happened between you, or the version of events they constructed to explain their choice, may have felt fundamentally wrong, not just hurtful, but structurally incorrect, as if they were describing someone you did not quite recognize, someone too needy or too intense or too demanding or too much, someone who wanted more than was reasonable, someone who was in the end the problem. That dissonance you felt, that quiet, persistent sense that the story they were telling did not match the reality you were living inside. That was not defensiveness. That was not denial. That was not the wounded ego protecting itself from a difficult truth. That was your perception working correctly. Because the story was not about you. It was never about you. It was about the parts of themselves they could not look at directly. And so they looked at you instead. And here is the part almost nobody talks about, because most people stop the story here, at the projection, at the wound. They stop at the pain of having been falsely seen, of having been made the canvas for someone else's unresolved interior. They do not follow what happens next. They do not track where this psychological process inevitably leads, because it requires patience, and it requires a willingness to understand something that most popular conversations about relationships do not have language for. But you are still here, and what comes next is the part that changes everything. Projection has a shelf life. This is one of the most important things Carl Jung ever observed about the unconscious, and it receives almost no attention in the way people talk about relationships and the people who have left them. Projection is not a permanent state. It is a defense mechanism, and like every defense mechanism, it requires continuous psychological energy to maintain. The mind has to keep working, keep reinforcing the story, keep editing the memories, keep reinterpreting the evidence to hold the projection in place, to keep you in the role it assigned you. At some point, that energy runs out. The collapse is not always dramatic. It does not always arrive as a single, devastating moment of clarity, though sometimes it does. More often, it is a slow erosion. A conversation where something you said years ago comes back to them in a completely different light. A moment where they witness someone else behaving in exactly the way they accused you of behaving, and they feel in the body, in the gut, in the place where truth registers before language catches up, the discomfort of recognition. A night where they are alone, truly alone, and the absence of you stops feeling like relief and starts feeling like a shape in the room. Something present that will not dissolve. What they are experiencing right now is the beginning of that erosion, or perhaps a far more advanced stage of it than they are prepared to admit. The projection is losing its structural integrity. The story is starting to feel unstable. The justifications are starting to require more effort than they used to. And underneath the instability, something they have been carefully avoiding for a long time is beginning to become visible. The realization that you were not the problem, you were the mirror. And what the mirror was showing them was something they were not ready to see. Drop 777 in the comments if you already felt this. If there was some part of you that always knew, even on the hardest days, that the version of you they were describing was never actually you. There is a particular kind of internal reckoning that happens when projection collapses, and it is uncomfortable in a way that is qualitatively different from ordinary regret. Ordinary regret is about outcomes. It is about wanting something back or wishing a decision had turned out differently. What this person is experiencing goes deeper than that. It is a confrontation with the gap between who they believed themselves to be, clear-eyed, fair, someone who had good reasons for everything they did, and who they may actually have been in those critical moments. Jung described this confrontation as the shadow making itself known, not through dramatic crisis, but through a persistent, low-level disturbance that will not go quiet no matter how much the conscious mind tries to rationalize it away. It shows up as irritability without a clear cause, as a restlessness in situations that should feel comfortable, a vague dissatisfaction with the present that has no obvious explanation as dreams. And Jung took dreams with extraordinary seriousness that return a person to the same unresolved emotional territory again and again, as if the unconscious has a question it needs answered before it will let the matter rest. And it shows up sometimes as a thought about you, an involuntary thought, the kind that arrives before the defenses have a chance to intercept it, in the moment between sleep and waking, or in the middle of something that should be completely unrelated. Not necessarily because they have decided they want you back, not yet, or not necessarily, but because the psyche is not finished processing what happened, because the parts of themselves they projected onto you are now returning home. And the homecoming is not gentle. What they are sitting with, whether or not they have the language for it, is the recognition that they may have misread you, that the lens through which they saw you was not neutral, that it was shaped by everything they had never dealt with inside themselves, and that you, in some way, they are only beginning to understand, paid the price for their unexamined interior. But what happens next changes everything, because this is the moment, this recognition, this beginning of the collapse, where most people in this person's position will do one of two things, and which path they take will tell you almost everything you need to know about where this is going. When the shadow begins its return, when projection starts to crumble, and a person is faced with the gap between who they thought they were and who they may have actually been, two fundamental responses are available to them. Jung mapped both, and both of them reveal something profound about the psychological development of the person experiencing them. The first response is resistance. It is the more common one. It looks like doubling down. New justifications, new framings, new reasons why the original story was correct. After all, it can look like a sudden and disproportionate anger toward you, toward the memory of what you shared, toward anyone who seems to challenge the version of events that was constructed to make the choice feel justified. This resistance is not evidence that they do not feel what they feel. It is evidence of how strongly they feel it. The intensity of the resistance tends to be proportional to the magnitude of what is being defended against. The louder and more urgent the justification, the more the psyche is working to hold something down that keeps pushing to the surface. The second response is quieter. It does not announce itself. It tends to begin as a question, so small it is almost unwilling, a whisper from somewhere beneath the constructed narrative. What if I was wrong about this? What if I was seeing something in them that was actually inside me? What if I lost something real because I could not face something true? This second response, this willingness to let the question in, is the beginning of what Jung called individuation, the long, difficult, and profoundly meaningful process of integrating the shadow rather than projecting it outward onto the people we are closest to. It is the start of someone actually growing, not in the self-help sense of the word, not in the sense of adding new habits or reading the right books. Growing in the only sense that Jung believed ultimately mattered, becoming more fully and honestly themselves. And whether this person is currently in the resistance phase or the opening phase, the fact that the process has begun at all, the fact that you remain present in their mind, that something has shifted, that the story no longer sits completely comfortably, means that the projection has already started to release its grip. You were right about them, not necessarily right about every detail, not right in the way that requires you to have been flawless or their story to have been entirely without foundation. But write about the most important thing. Write about the dissonance. Write about the feeling that the version of you they were presenting to justify their choices was not accurate. Write about the sense that something beneath the surface of their behavior did not match their stated reasons. Write about the quiet but persistent knowing that this was not entirely about you. That knowing, that quiet and stubborn internal compass that kept pointing in the same direction, even when everything external was pushing back against it, was not paranoia. It was perception. And perception, in Jungian psychology, is often the first and most reliable signal that projection is at work. If this is touching something you have been carrying for a long time, if something in what you are hearing is giving words to a feeling you could never quite articulate, subscribe to Carl Jung Psychology right now and turn on notifications. This channel exists for the people who already know something is true but needed someone to finally say it clearly. Drop 528 in the comments if this is making more sense of your story than anything else has. One of the most quietly validating things that Jung psychology does, and it may be the thing that matters most to you in this moment, is take seriously the intelligence of emotional perception. In a world that tends to privilege what can be measured, proven, logically demonstrated, Jung stood firmly on the side of the interior experience. He believed that the unconscious communicates in ways that bypass language entirely, that we feel things before we can explain them, that the body and the psyche register truth at a level the conscious mind sometimes takes years to fully catch up to. What this means for you is specific and important. The thing you sensed, the feeling that something was off, that the way they were treating you or framing you did not match what you knew about yourself, that there was a layer beneath the surface of what they were saying. That was not being acknowledged. That was not imagination. It was not insecurity performing itself as insight. It was not wishful thinking, running in a confusing direction. It was the unconscious doing precisely what the unconscious is built to do, detecting pattern, registering incongruence, sending a signal upward through the layers of the psyche toward the place where a person can finally act on what they know. The signal was, this is about them, and you received it. Maybe you doubted it. Maybe you spent weeks or months or longer trying to reconcile what you were feeling with what they were telling you, trying to find the version of yourself that matched their description, trying to adjust and shrink and reframe to make the story coherent, to find the place where their account and your experience could finally be made to fit together. That is what most people do under that kind of sustained pressure. That is the normal human response to being told with apparent certainty by someone whose opinion carries weight that your perception is the problem. But underneath all of that adjusting, all of that effortful fitting of yourself into a frame that was never built for you, the knowing was still there. It never fully left. It may have gone quiet in certain moments, but it did not disappear. And the fact that it is still here now, still clear, still pointing in the same direction, still present in you as you watch this, says something about the resilience of your own interior compass. You were right. You always knew you were right. And the part of you that held on to that knowing, even when holding on to it cost something, deserves to be acknowledged. This is where it gets genuinely complicated, because being right, finally feeling the shape of the truth settle into place, being vindicated after a period of sustained doubt is not always the clean, uncomplicated relief that people imagine it will be when they are in the middle of the uncertainty. What actually happens inside you when the validation finally arrives is something that Carl Jung psychology has found almost nobody ever fully prepares for. There is a relief, a deep, quiet, almost cellular relief, the kind that does not shout but exhales, the kind that says, I was not wrong, I was not too sensitive, I was not making something out of nothing. That relief is real. It is important. It deserves to be felt fully and without guilt and without apology. You carried something heavy. You carried the weight of someone else's shadow, and they placed it on you without fully realizing what they were doing. And you are allowed to feel the weight finally lift. But alongside the relief, there is often something else, something people do not expect and sometimes cannot name. A kind of grief that is different from missing a person. A grief for the time that passed, because the validation, the confirmation that you were right about them, does not undo what happened. It does not restore the nights you lay awake, doubting a perception that was completely accurate. It does not return the energy you gave to trying to locate the version of yourself that would finally fit their story. It does not unsay the things that were said. And this is where Jung's understanding of the shadow offers something genuinely consoling. Not in a soft or sentimental way, but in the hardest and most clarifying way possible. He believed that the wounds we carry from other people's projections, from having been made the screen for someone else's unexamined interior, hold within them some of the most powerful sources of self-knowledge available to us.
Not because the wound was necessary, not because the pain was good or instructive in some cosmic sense, but because being falsely seen, being placed in a role that was never accurate, forces something remarkable to happen. If a person can stay present through it, it forces you to know the difference between their perception of you and your actual self, with a precision that would be impossible to achieve any other way. When someone projects onto you, they inadvertently mark the border between what they need you to be and what you actually are. And learning to hold that border clearly, to stand inside your own truth, even when someone else's story is being told with great conviction about who you are, is one of the most psychologically strengthening things a person can experience. You know who you are. You know it more clearly now than before any of this began. And that clarity, earned through exactly this kind of experience, is not nothing. It may be among the most important things this connection has given you. Drop 11 in the comments if this is landing. If you can feel the distinction between who they said you were and who you know yourself to be, let us return to them, because something is genuinely changing. Not just on the surface, not just in the way that ordinary regret produces a temporary softening, but at a deeper structural level. And it is worth understanding what this shift looks like from the inside. Because it explains why what is happening for them right now is not simply a passing moment of doubt or nostalgia. When shadow projection begins to collapse, when the projections a person has been sending outward start their slow return, the internal landscape of that person changes in ways that are difficult to ignore and almost impossible to fully suppress. The person they built the story around stops being the flat, manageable character they needed you to be in order to feel justified in their choice. You become three-dimensional again. You become real again. And with that reality comes memory that lands differently than it did before, that carries a different emotional weight, a different quality of significance. Moments they dismissed start to carry weight they previously refused to hold. Things you said that were brushed aside or reframed as evidence of your instability or your neediness begin to replay with a different quality, a quality of accuracy they could not afford to acknowledge at the time. The care you showed that was minimized, the clarity you brought that was called aggression, the grief you expressed that was labeled as manipulation, the limits you held that were called cruelty. All of it is coming back to them now through a different filter. A filter that has had some of the projection cleared out of it. And what they are beginning to see, perhaps for the first time, with any real honesty, is you. Not the version of you that was convenient. not the screen onto which they projected the parts of themselves they could not face, but the actual person who was present throughout all of this, who held themselves with more integrity than they may have given you credit for, who saw something true in them that they were not yet willing to see in themselves, who stayed clearer than the situation perhaps deserved. This is what is changing everything. Not simply the loss of you, though that is part of it, but the collapse of the story that made the loss feel justified. That story was the scaffolding that held the whole structure together. And when the scaffolding begins to come down, what is left is the full and unmediated weight of what was actually real. Stay with this, because what follows is the part most people never reach. The part that is actually about you. Not about what they are feeling, not about whether they will reach out, but about what this moment is genuinely asking of you. Now, there is a question beneath all of this that deserves more than a moment's attention. Not the question of whether they will reach out, though that question is real and you are allowed to hold it. Not the question of whether what is shifting in them will shift anything between you, though that question too is legitimate. Those are both important, but they are not the most significant question available to you in this moment. The most important question is this: what do you do with the knowing? Because you were right about them. The shadow projection has begun to collapse. The internal reckoning is underway. The thing you sensed, the thing that felt so profoundly accurate, even when you were being told it was false, has proven itself. And now you are standing at a particular kind of crossroads that Jung described as one of the most significant junctures available to a human being in their psychological development. You have been through something that could have broken your trust in your own perception. Something that could have made you doubt the instrument of your own seeing so thoroughly that you would no longer know how to trust it. And it did not break you, not completely, not in the deepest place. The fact that you held on to what you knew, even imperfectly, even through days of genuine doubt, even in the moments when it would have been so much easier to simply accept their version and let the knowing go, means that something at the very center of you remained intact. That something is worth knowing, worth naming, worth consciously choosing to protect going forward. Not as a defense against the world, but as a foundation to build from. Because one of the most insidious effects of sustained projection, one of the things it does that rarely gets acknowledged, is its slow erosion of a person's relationship with their own perception.